It was a normal day, me coping with a toddler and a newborn baby, just getting the children ready to go out and buy some things to send out. There was a knock on the door. We live in a closed army barracks, so we don't get cold callers or anything like that. So as soon as I opened the door and saw two men in suits, I knew exactly what they were there to tell me. They asked to come in and said, you know, could they one of them take the children into another room to play while they talked to me, and I said, well, they're too young to understand what you're going to tell me anyway, it doesn't matter. We went in, sat down, and they explained that Ross had been killed literally a couple of hours before they'd told me. Eventually the visiting officer arrived with the CO, and they had more details of the ambush and just explained a little bit more of what their mission was and why they were there, and what had happened. And then it all became a blur then. There was just so many military people in the house to deal with paperwork and things that were going on, and explaining to me what the next stage was, and you know what was going to happen next, and when they could bring him home and things like that.
Yeah, they came and said that there would be a repatriation and they would come back. They would all come back together. But that took 12 days to accomplish. But it was a long time to wait. But having said that, the repatriation was beautifully done. In as much as these things can be beautifully done, but it was a very, very surreal experience to see 5 coffins coming out of the back of a aircraft, one of which belongs to you, and then they were put into the hearses and driven off, and that was it.
The repatriation was, I thought, very clinical. We had to go to a hotel the night before because it was a bit of a distance to go to Brize Norton. I stayed in a hotel, and because there was 3 families, the other families were in the hotel as well, but we didn't know them. You know, we hadn't met. We'd actually been sat in the bar next to them and never spoken. And then early in the morning we had to go to the station, to Brize Norton station, and into this kind of reception area where they had padres and brigadiers and generals, and you know, all coming up and giving their condolences, and you know, they're saying it was such a sad loss. And I thought, well, you didn't know him, but okay, thank you. Again, we were just sort of sat there. We must have been there for about 2 hours. And again, the other families were there, yet we were all in our separate areas, just kind of looking at each other and not knowing what to say to anybody. And then the plane came in, and we all went outside and watched the plane come in. But obviously it had a lot of military equipment, so we had to go back inside and wait another hour for them to unload the plane and then bring it back round to watch the coffins come off. And then once that was done, it was like, well, okay, he's back, but I still haven't got him. I still can't see him.
And that coffin comes out of the helicopter in such a regimental fashion, and all the regiment are there with all these senior officers, and they have a protocol and a procedure to adhere to receiving their dead person back into line. That was my boy. That wasn't a soldier in that coffin, that was my boy. And then they bring them very quietly in a regimental fashion with the bearers, all perfect. And they're walking up the runway, all perfect regimental steps to bring him to the coffin in the hearse that is just 10, 15 foot maybe away from us. And my boy was in there, and they expect us to sit all in rows, all regimental, sitting there. No. And I looked at my visiting officer and I said, Ian. And he just looked at me. I said, I have to go to him. Oh God, Cheryl, he said, please don't do that to me now. I said, Ian, I'm going. I know you are, he said, and I'm going to take you. And he did. And as his mum, I needed to do that. The following day, we read it in the papers. And when he came to visit, I said, please, when I ask you questions, you have to tell me openly and honestly. I need to know every single thing, every detail.
He didn't have really any detail that he could give us. The timings were wrong. There's little details like that get to you. They're so important when you're told these things.
And then the next set of waiting began. Given what had happened to them, DNA had to be sorted out to find,
We were told that for the post-mortems and everything, that it would probably take a month or so. And then I'd got a phone call saying they're releasing him tomorrow.
You can't progress along the grieving route without the major landmarks, like having a funeral.
And he went to Ireland on the Monday on an investigation to Limavady and Londonderry, and he was found dead in his hotel room on the Wednesday morning, having suffered a massive coronary. I apparently had agreed to different things in the first couple of days. For instance, I'd agreed to have some of Steve's colleagues in uniform as pallbearers for the funeral. I don't remember saying that.
But my mind then turned to, what was I going to do? Where was I going to go? I couldn't stay in the quarter. I could stay for a year, but I couldn't stay forever. And that then concentrated my mind on, what was I going to do? Where was I going to go? Would I stay locally? Would I move away?
Once the funeral was over with, again it was a bit of a sort of dull silence again. Okay, he's back now, but I was still living in an army house and still having all the paperwork and things to deal with. I was told that I could stay in the army quarter for 2 years if I wanted to, and if I still wasn't ready to move, then they would extend it for me, that there was no rush to get me out of the house.
I do feel very strongly that I lost not only my husband, but the RAF, my lifestyle, and I loved it. I loved the RAF. I served in the RAF before I ever met John, and I spent 19 years following him around it after we married, so I do feel doubly robbed almost.
When everything first happened, I'd had a letter from them explaining who they were and that they were there to give support, and I could join the Army Widows, and I just looked at it and thought, I'm not a widow, and just put it to the side and totally ignored it. And then once I'd moved into my own house and I didn't have the support of the army around me and didn't know anybody that even knew there was people that didn't even know anybody who was in the army, let alone somebody that this had happened to, that's when I needed a bit more support.
I think the main thing about sibling bereavement for me was definitely the loneliness, both at the time of the incident and a long time after. I am now 22, but was 20 when my brother died. There were only 2 of us, so I'm now only myself.
It's never ending. Sometimes it's a shock, sometimes you know it's coming, but it's still very weird all of a sudden You know, sometimes you can turn the news over and they're rolling through the names and his name comes up. Or, you know, there'll be a programme on the war in Iraq and what's going on in Afghanistan, and they show pictures again, and, you know, sometimes it is a bit of a surprise, and it does take you back to that day again.
And it became obvious that we were going to be, or at least Matthew was going to be, public property. And this is where you go to this thing. It's not a private death, a military death. Particularly if it's a death involved in a conflict situation. It's a public death. And it's not going to go away.
As soon as the name had been released on the news, which was within 24 hours, once all the family had been told, which is a bit of a surreal thing. All of a sudden the news comes up and there's your wedding picture and, you know, his name, and even though you know it's coming, it's still, you know, a shock to see it.
But it's difficult for us when you know that your son, who has just been killed, is going to be used as a vehicle for a media story. But his picture again is published in the newspaper along with the story. And 2.5 years later, it still hasn't gone away.
There's times when it's a shock, when it comes to the 50th person that's been killed or the 100th person that's been killed, and all of a sudden all the pictures are in the newspaper again. You just open the paper and there's the picture and you're like, oh, okay. It's never ending.